Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now, in this episode, we're taking a trip to Armenia. At least what's left of it, according to Armenia's very vocal opposition. To them, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan isn't merely unpopular, he's Armenia's greatest enemy. As you'll see, his opponents have smelled blood, and they aren't holding back. They say he's sold out Nagorno-Karabakh, betrayed national sovereignty, and swapped a steady Russian ally for the dubious comfort of Western handshakes. Sounds like an overdramatic TV show, doesn't it? Well, believe it or not, it gets worse. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Armenia's political situation may be heading for a tectonic shift. In the city of Gyumri, the recent municipal elections have led to a very rare display of unity from the Armenian opposition. Although incumbent Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's party secured the single largest share of votes, the combined opposition now has enough influence to pass a candidate they all agree upon as mayor. The result of these elections is just one of the many challenges that has been tossed out onto the mounting pile of difficulties lying ahead of Pashinyan. His recent plans to transform Armenian society have not been met with overwhelming public enthusiasm. Pashinyan's foreign policy is also the subject of widespread debate. Following the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, he has been shifting Armenia towards closer relations with the European Union and the United States. He has gone so far as to greenlight the long-term EU accession process for Armenia.
We are indeed entering a new dynamic phase in our relations with the European Union.
For decades, Russia was Armenia's main ally following the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. However, more conservative parts of Armenian society aren't fully eager to step away from this partnership. Should the opposition mount a solid campaign in the upcoming parliamentary elections next year, the entire political landscape of the Caucasus could change.
Now let's zone in on the East-plaining portion of our show. Nikol Pashinyan is one of the most recognizable leaders from the Caucasus. As Armenia's prime minister, he has walked a tightrope balancing between the West and maintaining relations with Russia. Let's take a closer look at how he came to power and what he has achieved so far.
Nikol Pashinyan came to power through a revolution. Despite the word's usual connotations, it was not a bloody one, which is a rarity across the tomes of human history. In April of 2018, Pashinyan led a series of vast protests against then Prime Minister Sargsyan, whom he accused of using his presidency to extend his grip on power. A similar ploy can be seen in how Vladimir Putin maintained power between 2008 and 2012. The protest resulted in Sargsyan's resignation and a peaceful transition of power to Pashinyan, who was elected interim prime minister. He went on to win in a landslide and snap elections later in the year. During his tenure as prime minister, Pashinyan has been focused on reforms. His government has been cracking down on corruption among officials and the judiciary. The biggest test for his government came in 2020, during the Nagorno-Karabakh war, which Armenia lost. In 2023, Azerbaijan, Armenia's historic rival, fully seized the region. Territorial concessions to Azerbaijan and this military defeat have led to public dissatisfaction with Pashinyan's leadership. Despite protests being organized by the Armenian opposition, Pashinyan has remained in office and is determined to continue pursuing his current policies.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Alright, let's start with the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh. Back in 2020, Armenia lost a brutal war to Azerbaijan, giving up most of a region Armenians considered sacred. But according to the opposition, losing wasn't the worst part. The real insult was Pashinyan signing what they call a humiliating ceasefire deal. Pashinyan called it peace, the opposition calls it surrender. And they could have a point, especially since Azerbaijan took advantage again in 2023, expelling over 100,000 ethnic Armenians from their homeland. Now fast forward to March 2025, and Pashinyan has now delivered his piece de resistance, a full-fledged peace treaty with Azerbaijan. But calling this peace might be stretching the definition beyond recognition. This treaty officially gives up Armenia's claim to Nagorno-Karabakh, explicitly accepting Azerbaijani sovereignty. The opposition describes this less as diplomacy and more like turning your lunch money over to a bully who promises not to punch you again, at least today. Now, Azerbaijan's not exactly signaling friendliness either. Just this February, broader clashes resulted in Armenian deaths. Yet, Pashinyan is offering concessions left and right and now promising a constitutional referendum to erase Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia's funding documents. Now, the opposition sees this as nothing less than a total betrayal. And honestly, when your neighbor repeatedly punches you, maybe stop handing over your gloves. Pashinyan's foreign policy strategy now includes breaking ties with Armenia's longtime security partner, Russia, in favor of warming up to the West. Now, whatever your opinion about Russia, it's pretty clear that they've had Armenia's back, at least militarily, for decades, right? Sure, they didn't exactly rush in to help during recent conflicts, but the opposition points out Russia's presence alone has been a deterrent against more aggressive Azerbaijani moves. Let's talk specifics too. In 2024, Pashinyan froze Armenia's participation in the Russia-led Collective Security Treaty Organization. He accuses Russia of conspiracy with Azerbaijan, a claim the opposition dismisses as paranoid nonsense. Now, according to the opposition, Armenia isn't diversifying its alliances, it's merely discrediting the last line of real defense. In short, Pashinyan's critics paint a picture of a prime minister who sacrificed his nation's pride and security for a shaky diplomatic fantasy. Whether you agree or disagree, Armenia's future is uncertain and quite tense looking forward. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Rafi Elliott, a political risk analyst at the Mirror Spectator. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thanks for having me back on the show.
So today we are examining the political situation within Armenia. Now, Prime Minister Pashinyan's critics have been very vocal, especially in light of the Nagorno-Karabakh situation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that one of their criticism is that they are foregoing kind of a more steady relationship with Russia in exchange for a more sort of dubious relation with the West. Is that a fair characterization?
That's definitely one of the criticisms, that Armenia has been more aggressively pursuing a realignment of its geopolitical situation, kind of decoupling from Russia and then going towards the European Union.
So comparing the current prime minister and their very vocal critics, do you think there is any merit when it comes to kind of their still sort of reliant on their relation with Russia, or do you think maybe it is time for some sort of change?
Well, as I've discussed on the show before, I think there are some valid concerns for many of the people in the opposition about the route that Armenia has been taking, because this is indeed uncharted territory for Armenia. Previously, Armenia has been one of Russia's most loyal neighbors and partners, and Armenia has a relationship with Russia going back 2 centuries in one way or another. However, that relationship has also been fraught with accusations of betrayal by Armenia against Russia whenever Russia felt that its own interests were better served, even if they were against Armenia's own interests. However, with that said, Armenia is part of the Eurasian Economic Union with Russia, which Russia kind of forced Armenia into joining about 10 years ago, with the quote-unquote promise of protecting Armenia in the case of any existential threats. These promises were, of course, unfulfilled, but Armenia remains a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is Russia's analogous to the European Union. The idea here being that Armenia pays low to no customs fees for goods that are transferred inside the EU. Armenia still is very heavily dependent on Russia as a export market, an import market, as well as a labor market, and Russia remains Armenia's largest energy supplier, particularly when it comes to natural gas, which the Eurasian Union membership allows Armenia to purchase at below market rates. So all of these could potentially be in jeopardy if Armenia continues to pursue integration into the European Union, which remains an open question because it requires all 27 EU member states to sign off on after Armenia goes through a long process of meeting the Copenhagen criteria, which are, as you know, the set of rules that define what is and isn't an EU eligible member state.
Right, so the way I see it, perhaps a lot of the Armenians are afraid of this kind of limbo period where their EU aspiration is going to alienate them from Russia. But of course, there's still a long way until they can actually reap the benefits of being aligned with the European Union. So is there any way, if the EU were to bring it to its fold, that they can help smooth the transition and making sure that they're not kind of left there in limbo?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. I mean, it's really this transition period that's difficult. And there's another aspect to it is that whether Russia is or isn't willing to, it is at this point the only power in the region that can also provide physical security for Armenia in theory. However, of course, that's been greatly diminished by Russia's involvement in a quagmire in Ukraine. But it remains that the EU can provide economic security eventually. It can provide some amount of support in economic and democratic development, but it does not, as of yet, provide any real physical bulwark to the existential threats that Armenia faces, particularly from Turkey and Azerbaijan. So with that said, the EU has nevertheless been involved with Armenia since the EU's inception in 2000. And before that, with the European community, since Armenia gained its independence, it's been funding in numerous projects. It's been supportive of a variety of projects that have been designed to bring Armenian regulations in line with the EU's for over a decade. Those, ironically, those plans had been disturbed by Armenia's sudden joining of the Eurasian Union under the Russians. Because initially, back in 2012, Armenia was preparing to sign a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, which, had that gone through, would have considerably accelerated the process of integration, and we wouldn't be in the situation. However, yeah, continued engagement, continued support, opening a visa facilitation. Right now, the EU has simplified this visa process for the Schengen applications. However, it still requires a visa. Armenia and the EU are currently in talks to remove visa requirements for tourists, students, and business visas. And there are many such projects also in the works.
All right, now we're observing from the outside looking in, and there's, of course, some very vocal, very loud dissents, but I'm also curious when it comes to the Armenian population, when it comes to the societal outlook, how are people rating or kind of perceiving Prime Minister Pashinyan as of the moment?
The Prime Minister has been steadily maintaining quite low approval ratings. However, they remain the highest ratings for any politician in Armenia, and it has been the case for the last 2 or 3 years. He rates in the low double digits, sometimes lower, depending on which polls we ask. But he is still ahead of the pack compared to everyone else. As with last time, the most popular candidate in Armenia right now is none of the above. Of course, it's understandable given Armenia's continued precarious situation, the instability around the border, and the very difficult decisions that have been made by this government, which the government itself hopes will pay off in the medium to long term in a more stable outlook for the country. But in the moment, it's hard really to explain it.
Right. I do not envy anyone that has to deal with all of these complex political situation. And like you described, this seems like a very kind of Gordian knot situation to untie. So it's no surprise that it's really hard to garner like majority support. How's the population's perception when it comes to, even if they do have a European aspiration, it almost feel like a leap of faith? Do you think with this kind of lower approval rating and no confidence in any of the politicians, they can see a realistic path forward?
I think it's totally it's a good characterization to say it's a leap of faith. However, I'd say I think most of the Armenian population has always seen Armenia as a European state, and it seems like a natural reach to our aspirations. While Pashinyan's ratings remain low, as I said, like the key opposition groups in Armenia are primarily built around the previous regime forces, as they're called here, the governments, the semi-autocratic presidents who ran the country before the 2018 Velvet Revolution, and therefore are considerably more discredited. Incidentally, they're the ones who are most tied to Russia. And in the last few years, with Russia's inaction towards Armenia, given the Nagorno-Karabakh situation that you alluded to earlier, the exodus of the population, despite the presence of Russian peacekeepers who stood aside and allowed the ethnic cleansing to take place, Russia now polls very low in Armenian ratings. When asked, for example, who are the biggest threats to Armenia, Russia often ranks second after only Turkey or even Azerbaijan in terms of threats to Armenia. Meanwhile, the flip side of it is that while maybe Armenia's relationship with the EU in the minds of the Armenian public remains somewhat nebulous, Armenia does have a very good and increasingly improving relationships with individual European nation states, in particular France, which has really stepped up in defense of Armenia's interests and has turned into one of Armenia's major economic and also arms suppliers. And that is reflected in the polling, which show France replacing Russia in the majority of the Armenian population's opinion as being the #1 friend of Armenia. And France being a major decision-making in the EU also is reflected.
Do you think that this phenomenon will start rolling back if, in any case, like Russia starts, kind of the Russian-Ukrainian war starts to die down and Russia reaffirming its grasp on Armenia?
Yeah, so as we've established, it's a pretty precarious situation. And Armenia's relationship with Russia has kind of ping-ponged in the last 2 or 3 years. And in reality, they're slightly improving in the last several months, despite what we just discussed as Armenia's continued westward shift. So Armenia has learned in the last few years to better balance its relationships and to democratize its international relations. So Armenia is still very reliant on Russia, and that won't change. But it's also worth pointing out that our Russia is somewhat reliant on Armenia as well. Upwards of 80,000 Russians, many of whom were amongst Russia's creative and educated class, have moved to Armenia and moved their businesses with them. A lot of money enters Russia now, or goods enter Russia through Armenia, because Armenia is a member of the Eurasian Union, as mentioned. So there's also dependency going the other way around. Granted, it's not nearly as much, but it remains that Armenia has learned to better balance its relationship with its neighbors, including Iran, Turkey, and Russia. And while in the last couple of years, Russia seems to have chosen Azerbaijan as a more reliable partner, given Azerbaijan's higher importance as an energy exporter and also a re-exporter of Russian gas into the EU, and therefore sort of circumventing sanctions on Russian gas and oil. There's also just a personal relationship that President Putin has with President Aliyev of Azerbaijan, both of whom being former KGB autocrat, like strongmen types who understand each other and both literally and figuratively speak the same language. A relationship that is not shared, for example, with Pashinyan, who himself is the result of a populist uprising and sort of a bottom-up democratic vote.
Right, so how to kind of balance and juggle all these kind of different players going forward is going to be a very tough task ahead. But in the meantime, thank you so much for all your input and insight and helping it wrap this situation.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being with us. Cheers.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East I don't want to miss. A breakthrough may be on the horizon when it comes to the war in Ukraine. A senior U.S. official has reportedly told the New York Post that Ukraine is willing to cede territory as part of a peace deal.
US President Donald Trump says that he will soon present his country's proposal for a peace agreement. Various media outlets have been releasing leaks of speculation as to what this deal could entail. One version suggests that European troops will be deployed to Ukraine as a so-called resilience force tasked with enforcing a ceasefire. What's more, this proposal also allegedly includes a separate joint peacekeeping mission, which would involve Ukraine, Russia, and a third non-NATO country. An anonymous US official has reportedly said that the US might contribute financially to this venture, but it would not put boots on the ground. The most surprising claim is that Ukraine is apparently willing to give up 20% of its territory. The New York Post report says that this would be a de facto recognition. This means that Ukraine would recognize that Russia occupies the aforementioned territory, but that does not mean that Kiev will give it up for good.
Staying on the issue of Russian activity in occupied Ukrainian territory, Ukraine's security service has released a string of charges. The issue concerns 14 Russian Orthodox church leaders being involved in the illegal seizure of churches in Russian-occupied Ukraine.
In Russia, it is not a secret that the church and the state are interconnected, though not in immediately obvious ways. The Russian Patriarch Kirill, for example, is a strong supporter of both Vladimir Putin and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He was put on Ukraine's wanted list in late 2023 on charges of infringing on Ukrainian territorial integrity. Kiev's security service says that it was under his direction that a forced takeover of religious communities in the occupied regions of eastern Ukraine took place. Local leadership was replaced with pro-Moscow individuals who not only promoted Kremlin propaganda, but who also endorsed the war. The 14 clerics who are behind this operation, the SBU says, are part of what is known as the Kremlin-controlled Holy Synod. They have been charged in absentia.
With one hand, the Georgian Dream is downplaying the EU's move to suspend visa-free travel to the bloc from Georgia. With the other, it is bracing itself for a scenario that will have far-reaching consequences it doesn't want to admit.
Brussels has not yet officially decided to suspend visa-free travel for Georgians in the wake of the Georgian Dream's crackdown on pro-democracy protests and policy decisions that have been deemed authoritarian. Should the EU move forward with this decision, it would add fuel to the fire when it comes to the public's outrage towards the Georgian Dream. Already, thousands of Georgians accuse their government of all but destroying the country's dreams and aspirations of joining the wider Western community and the European Union itself. The Georgian Dream, at least outwardly, tries to show that it sees the matter differently. Government officials have been using supposedly pro-patriotic narratives to downplay the significance of visa-free travel to the bloc. The Georgian Dream's opponents, however, have urged caution against a blanket suspension, as they believe that the entire population shouldn't be punished for the government's actions.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. For more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.